This weekend's subject, What Matters Most, sadly has a very pretentious title, and I don't mean it to be pretentious. I mean it to be provocative. I want you to consider what matters most to you. And all I'm doing in the book is from a rather eccentric point of view, which is to say a Jungian point of view, in which case saying eccentric and Jungian is probably redundant, to provoke people to think about what moves us psychologically. We are able through our corporeal senses to see the tangible world, but can we in any way see the invisible world that runs, governs, and dictates to the tangible world? Until we can't even begin to become psychological. Freud's response to the question, what matters most, was very succinct and very astute. He said it's work and love. And that's a pretty good list. And I'm not going to repeat the other obvious choices, work, love, relationship, friends and family, and that sort of thing, because they're obvious. And what I'd like to do is simply, since I can't summarize the entire book this evening, I'd like to just mention 2 or 3 of the major ideas that are in the book, and we'll pick up some more tomorrow in the workshop. I'd like, first of all, to mention some of the ideas that were candidates for inclusion, but were dropped for various reasons, including having been the subject of previous books. So these are the rejects, half a dozen of them perhaps. As I mentioned the last time I was here, or perhaps the time before, the most important thing we can do in the second half of life is the recovery of personal authority. It's in the nature of our obligatory adaptations to the demands of life that we lose contact with our own truth, with our own center. And so nothing will work right in the second half of life until such time as we can begin to recover a sense of our own truth and find the courage to live that in the world. And when I use the phrase the second half of life, I'm not speaking chronologically. I'm speaking of those moments when we are obliged to take account and to say what's going on here. What are the forces making choices for me? Why these patterns? Why does this turn up in such a repetitively self-defeating way? Or why do my relationships turn out the same way? When we begin to ask those kinds of questions in very serious ways, then the issue of personal authority really comes up heavily on the screen. Secondly, another rejected candidate was the importance of grieving consciously, because anyone who walks on the planet very long experiences loss, disappointment, and we have to, in the second half of life, develop a philosophy of discrepancy. Somehow the acknowledgement of the gap between what we expected of the world and what we've received and what we expect of ourselves and what we're capable of providing. And what we thought the contract we had with the world was going to produce and what in fact has washed up on our shores. Another candidate I rejected, although I think it's important, is the necessity of risking love and compassion in the face of a world that will continuously hurt us, and to open ourselves to relationship in ever new ways. And to do that is, of course, to engage in the dialectic with the other, and to realize that the greatest gift that we ever get from the other is their otherness. Because what they bring to us is, in their otherness, something that asks us to enlarge our sensibility, reframe our sense of reality, and somehow out of that process reach an enlarged consciousness. Now, talk is cheap. That's usually achieved in a very difficult and sometimes conflictual and sometimes painful ways. So in a way, to undertake new relationship is really to undertake new problems, but perhaps in a very developmental way. Another candidate that didn't quite make this book was to recognize the ubiquity of shame-based agendas that govern so much of our lives. All of us feel, in the course of our development, contaminated by life. We've internalized much of the message of our environment as being about us. That's the magical thinking of childhood. And shame-based behavior shows up in the many avoidances, aversions, self-sabotage that we can find in the patterns of our lives, or often in the grandiosity through which we seek to impose ourselves upon the world and to solicit accolades to our importance and so forth. And all of these arise out of a sense of shame. Also, as the Greek maxim, nothing to excess, reminded us to forever seek psychological balance, neither too high nor too low. And in the end, to realize that we have a soul. A soul is our essence, our core, and we're accountable to it. And we will find in the venues of suffering, in the savannas of suffering, tasks, the addressing of which will enlarge our life and the flight from which continues to diminish it. And also to maintain a sense of humor throughout all of this. As the French playwright Molière said once, life is a tragedy to those who feel, but it's a comedy to those who think. And a sense of humor, I think, is critical to our survival. If you think that you have been given a raw deal by life, be comforted by Frost's little couplet in which he says, "Forgive, O Lord, my little joke on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big joke on me." Or if you're suffering depression, think about the horse who walked into the bar room and the bartender said, "Hey, why the long face?" This is the pause for you to get that. Or if you have the fear of mortality, remember Woody Allen suggesting that the lion shall lie down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get very much sleep. Or if you're interested in Jungian psychology, you can have the experience I had recently at a Barnes & Noble. I walked in and I said, "Can you show me to the self-help section?" And the clerk said, "Well, if I did that, it would defeat the purpose." We have to remember that modern psychology, that is to say depth psychology or psychodynamic psychology that seeks to deal with the invisible world rather than the tangible world of behaviorism and pharmacological process and so forth, has its origin in the dismay and discomforts of the 19th century and the progressive disconnect of individuals from the great orders of mystery. The mystery of the cosmos, why are we here? The mystery of nature, how do we as natural creatures live in harmony with the world around us? The mystery of relationship and community, who are my people? How do I come to you, in what forms? And ultimately the mystery of selfhood too, what is my own journey about and whither am I bound? These are the critical questions that have always been central to the human condition. And happy is the person who lives in a culture that has living images, charged images, that link one in a feeling way to these mysteries. And unhappy is the person for whom those images have tended to fade or the linkages have eroded. Such a person, as Jung noted in one of his letters, falls off the roof of the medieval cathedral into the abyss of the self. And that's why depth psychology has come to address, in at least a partial way, the question of identity, the question of mystery, and the questioning of finding guideposts or markers along the way to find our way through the dark wood. Because whenever the mysteries are not experienced as living, felt presences, we will internalize them as individual psychopathology or somatic disorder, or we will, as commonly happens, project them into the outer world and then come to be owned by the numinosity that we have been seeking that seems to come to us through the objects of our desire and become enslaved to those objects at the same time. So in thinking about how could I just sort of summarize some of the ideas that are in this book, I thought I would just pick out three. And the first chapter is titled something like that it's critical or it's important that we not live our lives governed by fear. Now that sounds very negativistic and very reductionistic, but the older I get, the more it's clear that our condition, fragile as it is obliged to make many, many adaptations and adjustments, as I mentioned before. Each of us makes what we might call a phenomenological reading of the world. That is to say, it's not cognitive, it's experiential. We read the world, we internalize it. What's it about? What's it saying to me? Who am I in relationship to that? What's the nature of the traffic between us? Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Do I approach it? Do I run from it? Elemental decisions about self and world and strategies of adaptation designed to get our needs met and to stay out of harm's way as best we can manage become essentially core perceptions, or what one might call core complexes. And a complex, remember, is a neutral word. It merely means a charged cluster of our experience, which then becomes a kind of interpretation of the world. Jung called them splinter personalities, and we can say with each of these splinter personalities, there's a splinter script as well, an implicit de facto mythological system. And these responses provide an archaic, provisional sense of self and of world, based on an inaccurate, disempowered, infantile perception of self and universe. And at the deepest level of our being are these archaic perceptions about self and other and reflexive responses between them. As I mentioned a moment ago, the second half of life begins not chronologically, but whenever psychologically we are stunned or obliged for whatever reason to begin to reflect on what are those core ideas or values or internalized scripts that are governing my life and producing these patterns. Because we don't waken in the morning and say, well, I think today I'm going to repeat the stupidities of my history. I don't think today that I'm going to be counterproductive, but by the end of the day we will have. And we recognize that those patterns arise from these deeply buried archaic values and ideas. And when we begin to question them, we say, now, who am I apart from my history? You know, that's a simple-minded question, but it's also a radical and profound question. Who am I apart from my history? Who am I apart from my roles? Good roles, bad roles, who am I apart from them? What are the agencies within me that are making the choices, from whence they derive? What is their message? Because part of becoming psychological is taking the patterns of our life, the consequences, working backward from that visible, tangible world into the invisible world. Because what we do is logical, based upon the emotional premise that we are in service to. The premise may be flawed, may be inaccurate, as I mentioned, or coming from another time and place. But what we do is an expression of service to that unconscious idea. How is it that I've now become my own chief obstacle? This was the single most important thing I learned in 6 years in Zurich. I felt when I went that it would be like a graduate school where you learn certain ideas, techniques, behavioral patterns, and so forth. And to a degree it was, but it was far less important. What was probably more the case was to recognize that in this assemblage, necessary assemblage of provisional values and stratagems, we are based not upon our own interior reality, but by the reading of the world, the circumstances that have come to us. And so then there's a strange paradox that what I have become is now my chief obstacle. Now, this is a very perturbing and disturbing thought to the ego, because we remember the task of the first half of life is ego building, to build a sense of self strong enough to enter the world, to leave mother and father, to create relationship, career, etc., etc. And then to say, and what I've become is now my obstacle. This is a profound disorientation, confusion, can even be felt as a defeat. And Jung observed, as many of you know, that many times the encounter with the self will be experienced as defeats for the ego, where it begins to realize that while I imagine myself to be a sovereign here, I am in fact in servitude to often these deeply buried unconscious ideas. So a new set of questions has to emerge for the second half of life. Am I living my life or the received script from someone else? Am I living the unlived life of my parents? Am I serving the mores and values of my culture, and are they consistent with my own inner life, and how would I know? Or another kind of question, what wants to come into the world through me? This is not a question of an inflated ego. It's quite the contrary. It's a summons to servitude by the ego. What wants to come into the world through me? Which I am somehow, whether it brings me comfort or the approval and understanding of others or not, I am somehow to render choices that call me into service to that which seeks to come into the world through me. In important distinctions of choice or junctures in our life, we ask the question, does this choice enlarge me or does it diminish me? And I think usually intuitively we know the answer to that question. We may not like the answer. It may put us in some harm's way, and at the same time, we know the answer. So our daily challenge then, our summons, if you will, in the conduct of life, is to swear to ourselves that these fear management systems, necessary as they have been and replicated as they have become, that they not govern our lives and govern our choices, lest we remain in some way tied to fate and to the sort of shadowy governance systems that they embody for us. This is what Jung meant by that homey metaphor, we all walk in shoes too small for us. Meaning by that, we essentially live our lives in these adaptive psychologies. And in his book, Symbols of Transformation, in which he made his major departure from Freud, he said, the spirit of evil is negation of the life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear, and if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. That's pretty clear. So when we ask ourselves, whom am I serving when I serve the fear management systems? In the end, we all have an accountability. All psychologies, all religions, all ethical systems say that at the end of our life, no matter what formative influences were at work, we are accountable for our choices and for their consequences. The accountability is certainly to the outer world, to our children, to our society, to our partners, but it's also, there's an accountability to our inner life as well. The real question is there a soul? And do we serve it? So the first chapter in the book is really a summons to examine the degree to which these necessary adaptations and fear management systems have come, however necessary they were, how they've come to have a life of their own, authority of their own, and of course link us in a kind of deterministic way to our history. A second idea is a strange paradox. You may have heard the phrase before, amor fati, which means to love one's fate. To love one's fate and yet at the same time to fight it. And that's a paradox. As Jung said, the most important truths in life are those which can only be expressed by paradox, because an ordinary truth is easily contradicted by another truth. But for important truths, the opposite is also always true. So the love of one's fate and the fighting of it is where we find the critical nexus for the hammering out of the experience of soul in our lives. Put it this way, and very, very succinctly, that the meaning of our life in the second half of life will be found precisely in the degree to which we can evolve into that being which the gods intended or nature intended in the face of the obstacles that fate has presented. We don't choose those obstacles. Fate presents them, whether they're internal or external. But to become who we are capable of becoming in the differing ways in which that occurs is the task of life. And as Jung said, we're not supposed to fit in. We're not supposed to be well-adjusted. We're supposed to be eccentric. We're supposed to be different. What would a mosaic look like if every piece was the same? Every piece has to be contributing its own uniqueness, its own difference. And that's our gift to each other, paradoxically. Now, in other words, put in classical terms, to what degree can we serve destiny in the face of our fate? Destiny is that which wishes to become. Fate is that which limits. And right there in the middle is the human being making choices. What kind of choices? Based on what premises? It gets awfully complicated when we realize a lot of the premises are unconscious. It gets complicated when we realize that the lens through which we see the world, in fact, is often grounded by the experience of the family of origin or the popular culture and so forth. And so we'd have to say how difficult it is to choose wisely, how difficult it is to choose consciously in the face of these obstacles. And yet, again, in the end, we're accountable for how this all turns out. Now, for example, for so many of us, there are areas where we collude in our own diminishment because, again, we're in service to shaming values. Or I find many times in people who have been perhaps very accomplished in the outer world and yet do not feel a core sense of permission to be who they are. A core sense of feeling the legitimacy of feeling what you feel, wanting what you want, pursuing what matters to you. And as obvious as that sounds, we find there are so many internal inhibitions and systems which abrade and undermine our capacity to live our life into the world. Possibly the biggest challenge to living our life fully is paradoxically in the fact of our mortality itself. I mean, we are a strange species in that we have to understand that the self, which was Jung's metaphor for the verb that we are. See, the human ego tends to think in terms of nouns. It's more comfortable when it can objectify things. When in fact, the world is a grand verb, and it's a verb that's verbing. In other words, everything is energy. Everything is in process. This podium, which has the temporary appearance of solidity, is in fact swirling masses of energy. At the subatomic level, it is nothing but energy in infinite spaces. And what then are we? We would have to say that the self is not a noun. You don't find it on your MRI. If it were an object, you'd see it there. It's a verb, so the self is selfing. And then the real question is, how is this self to consider the fact that part of its agenda is its own dissolution in mortality? There's a strange paradox there. That's what creates an enormous division in our consciousness. As a great American philosopher, Woody Allen, said once, the universe is but a passing thought in God's mind. This is a pretty uncomfortable thought if you've just put down a down payment on a house. So the irony is we work so hard to achieve an ego, and yet the greatest affront to the ego's fantasy of sovereignty is its own mortality. And yet that nervous Nelly keeps sort of whistling through the dark alleys of life and acting as if it's unimpressed by all of this. Now, much has been said on this subject. The Greeks had the myth of Tithonus, who was immortal, but he found that his life was lacking in meaning. He found that the choices didn't matter, because you could do one thing one century and reverse course the next century, and another pattern another century. And so in order that his life have meaning, he asked the gods for mortality so that choices would matter, so that this life would matter. Albert Camus, the French existentialist novelist and philosopher, said, life is meaningful precisely because it's absurd. Now, I don't know what he meant by that, but my speculation would be this. I think what he means is if someone says, now here's the package, here's the meaning, what they're saying is, here's my package. Here's my meaning, rather than say, if life is absurd, and surely its greatest absurdity is we are this being conscious of our own mortality. If it's absurd, then you realize your choices matter. What are your values? What are the things you care about? What do you stand for? How do you live your life in the face of the circumstances of life? If it's absurd, then every choice you make is profoundly constructive, profoundly meaningful. And what are those choices, and where do they come from? Now, one of the oldest of human stories about this human dilemma is found in the Iraqi myth of Gilgamesh that is 40 centuries ago. And in rereading it recently, I was astonished at how parallel it was to a similar work in the Hebrew literature of 22 centuries ago, the work of Ecclesiastes. In both cases, the central figure recognizes the central futility of the journey. In fact, some of you would be familiar in the Ecclesiastes version if you look at the King James translation where it says all is vanity. And in fact, the Hebrew word hebel means mist. All is mist. When you grab hold of it, what you have is a handful of mist. And so 40 centuries ago and 22 centuries ago, our ancestors are wrestling with the central question that we're looking at here. How is it possible to achieve the amor fati, the love of one's fate? And both of those sources of wisdom say the same thing, essentially. Find the work that is meaningful to you, and to do it with all of your capacity. Love the persons at your side, and ultimately submit to the will of the divinities. And it's interesting how parallel they are in their recognitions. And so another way of looking at that in perhaps modern terms is to say, how do I live in relationship to this central fact of my nature? Jung said that all of our problems stem from one source, and he said that we have become estranged from our instincts. And surely the cultural neurosis around mortality is itself a profound statement of estrangement, especially in our time with the mythic disconnection that I've spoken of. When one lives in a culture that is in service to what variously could be called the archetype of the Great Mother, or the cycle of sacrifice, or the Great Wheel, or the eternal return, or whatever the variant may be, one understands that one is participating in a great drama of death and rebirth that transpires not only in nature but in human culture as well. But with the erosion of those kinds of linking images, individuals are thrown back into the provinces of the ego. And the ego, again, is a kind of nervous Nelly, runs around trying to distract itself as much as possible or to narcotize itself as much as possible. So then the ego is not likely to ask other kinds of questions. How will I deal with the fact when the guy with the scythe shows up at my door? Will I say, for example, I am an exception? Can I ask myself the question, should I live longer than my predecessors? Should I live longer than you? And why? Should I outlive my children? More importantly, how am I to live while I'm here? And again, if we don't address these questions consciously, they're being addressed in the unconscious. Again, they're coming out as projections into the outer world, as objects that have a numinous appeal to us, on the one hand, or they get internalized as our depressions or anxiety disorders or our addictions. Jung said, and I quote, "People who feared life when they were young suffered later just as much from the fear of death. When they are young, one says they have infantile resistances against the normal demands of life. One should really say the same thing when they are old, for they are likewise afraid of life's normal demands." Now again, it's perfectly understandable why the ego is threatened with its own dissolution. At the same time, you see, there's the challenge to say this is a central given to our fate. How is it that one can love this fate? And it's only possible if and to what degree the ego can reposition itself in the context of something larger. Now, our dilemma in very succinct terms is this, that we have a dual gift from nature or from divinity, whichever metaphor you prefer. One is the gift of life, and the second is the gift of consciousness. And then we owe a dual gift. One is to a life fully lived and fully served, and secondly, to a life surrendered at the end. As the sage of Tupelo, Mississippi said once, ultimately we all return to sender, address unknown, no such number, no such phone. But in thinking about this issue from the standpoint of a kind of psychologically nuanced ego, and asking ourselves, is it possible to embrace my fate and to live fully in the face of it? Three things. First, if there's an afterlife, then it's another life. It's not this one. This is the one we are presently charged to live fully, whether it's an end or a beginning. And secondly, from looking at it from the ego standpoint, whatever we think, feel, intuit, believe, hope from our limited ego frame is literally irrelevant to the mystery of mortality itself. In death, either our ego state is radically transformed in ways we cannot even imagine, or it's annihilated. Either way, our present fears and fantasies are rendered moot and void. Thirdly, we must admit huge ambiguity, also acknowledge that humankind has long intuited the presence of other energies which suggest that this ego journey is but a small piece of a larger puzzle. Now, Freud was very severe in looking at this question, and I respect him for doing so, because we have to try to differentiate the wish fulfillment of the ego, the fantasy of its immortality, and its inflation in its actual state of vulnerability. And on the other hand, to say that humankind has reported from the earliest of reports of an intimation or an intuition of a larger realm of mystery of which we are but small pieces. In a very fine essay called The Soul and Death by Jung, which I would suggest to each of you to read, Jung writes, and I quote, he said, "I was astonished to see how little ado the unconscious psyche makes of death. It would seem as though death were something relatively unimportant, or perhaps our psyche doesn't bother about what happens to the individual. But it seems that the unconscious is all the time interested in how one lives and how one dies. That is, whether the attitude of consciousness is adjusted to living and to dying or not." Now, I would report similar findings in working with people who were overtly in the presence of their death, and in which their dreams and intuitions are not about termination, but about journeys, transitions, crossings, and so forth. In the 1940s, Jung had a very severe heart attack and nearly died. And of this near-death experience, he wrote to his friend Christine Mann. This is from a letter. He said, "My illness proved to be a most valuable experience, which gave me an inestimable opportunity of a glimpse behind the veil. The only difficulty is to get rid of the body, to get quite naked and void of the world in the ego will. When you can give up the crazy will to live, and when you seemingly fall into a bottomless mist, then the truly real life begins with everything which you were meant to be and never reached. It is something ineffably grand. I was free, completely free and whole, as I never felt before." And that's from his letter to Christine Mann. Now, in looking at this, we realize that, just to go back to the beginning of this second idea, the paradox of the amor fati and also fighting one's fate at the same time, that the greatest element of the amor fati is our mortality and our consciousness of that possibility, or in fact inevitability. And so the task then is, to what degree do we become and serve the project that we are meant to serve by becoming more fully who we are, really are, in the face of these limitations. And secondly, to realize that the strange paradox that our life is meaningful precisely because it's over against something. It's not in terms of a limitless other or a void. It's because it's defined. So the choices are finite, they are limited, and they matter. And the quality of our life comes directly out of the nature and quality of those choices. The third point is perhaps the most important and maybe the hardest to explain. That I think that apart from tending to the daily tasks of life, paying off the mortgage, supporting our children, attending to the legitimate obligations of daily life. The single most important thing in the second half of life would be to pay attention to and to attend those occasional apertures from the visible world into a larger invisible world, how and in what way they happen. There's a passage which I've always been drawn to by a French surrealist poet at the beginning of the 20th century, Paul Éluard, where he said, "There is another world, and it is this one." And I think what he meant by that is from time to time, if we become psychologically aware, which is to say really spiritually aware, if we become psychologically aware, we recognize we have had a momentary apprehension of or intimation of invisible energies beneath the cerements of the visible world. Now let me give you an example which will appear to be totally absurd. Before moving to Houston 12 years ago, I lived about 4 miles from the casinos of Atlantic City. And I mentioned that on a previous visit, I recall. And you may or may not know that the most visited spots in the world by pilgrims, by tourists, not by people commuting to their job, but by tourists, is not Mecca. That's only 3 million a year. Not the Big Apple. It's around 10 million. Not Disney World or Disneyland. That's between 12 and 14 million a year. But it's Atlantic City and Las Vegas, and they average between 33 and 38 million a year, every year, both of them. Now, never in human history has there been a migration of humanity of that proportion. Especially a voluntary one. There are no invading hordes, there's no climatic change, or if there is, that's another matter. There is something else that pulls people to undertake often an expensive journey there. And what is it that is fueling that kind of pilgrimage? And I use that word quite literally, a pilgrimage. It's in service to some higher value. And what is that? Well, we'd say, well, it's money. Well, but what's money? Money is pieces of paper, pieces of metal. No inherent value. But we've projected an awful lot upon them. So we ask ourselves, well, what is going on in the unconscious that mobilizes that kind of behavior time and time again on the part of so many? And we realize to the degree that individuals are not served by their culture in having access to images that, again, link them to the divinities, to nature, to their tribe, and to their own journeys, then they'll be looking for it in the world outside of them. Those needs, profound as they are and universal as they are, will be projected outwards. And so what is it one's looking for? Well, one's looking, for example, for reconnection somehow with a mystery, somehow with Lady Luck, with chance, to connect again with the mystery. And we remember that the etymology, the word religion, means to rebind back to or reconnect with, because we all feel separated and estranged. So there's a desire to connect again with some mysterious energy. Secondly is the desire to have one's horizontal existence have a vertical dimension. Something useful, important, or interesting, or curious, or significant happens to give a vertical dimension. In Camus' novel, The Fall, he said how wonderful it is when you have a murder in the neighborhood. Something's happened, gets everybody's blood stirring. It's a wonderful thing when you can arrange a neighborhood murder. Well, it's a search for the transcendent, the vertical dimension. And thirdly, there's the fantasy that by winning money, one's life will be transformed in a constructive way. Despite the fact that the world is filled with literal examples of the most cliched misery that arises out of the people who do win money, not to mention that they are a tiny group. But when you think about it, reconnection, transcendence, transformation, those are profoundly religious values, aren't they? And if not served sufficiently in the culture, they go underground and come out as projections onto objects of desire, and in time come to own people. In other words, when the mysterious sources of things are not experienced as living, felt force fields of energy, then we internalize them as somatic disorders or our neuroses, or we project them into the world and then become captivated by them. And the chief projective source of the good life in our time, of course, is materialism. And if it worked, we would know by now. And you remember Robert Johnson saying in the book he said, in our time, romance replaced institutional religion as the chief source of meaning in the lives of individuals. When you're in love, your world is rich and apparelled with glory. And when you're not, you're miserable and disconnected. And we'd have to recognize that in this, there is always a sense of the human need to connect with something that matters. Now, I'd like to give you a couple of personal examples of what I would consider apertures into mystery. One of them occurred a number of years ago. It's probably about 94, I would say. I was invited to speak in Stockholm, and my ancestors had been Swedish, although my mother's parents were dead long before she ever met them, so she was essentially orphaned, and there was never any talk of Sweden or of anything like that in our history. So as far as I was concerned, it was simply an opportunity to go see a country that I'd never had the privilege of visiting before. So my wife and I went, and the first evening we were in Stockholm, we were taken to an outdoor restaurant where people sat at tables and had dinner. And at twilight, the Swedish flag there was lowered, and they played music that was identified to me as the Swedish national anthem. And I had a strange experience at that moment, and a voice in my head, or somewhere, that said to me, I have come back for you. I remember thinking, what was that? As we went back to our hotel that night, I reflected on that, and I thought, isn't that peculiar? Because it had, you have to trust me on this, we had never any conversation about Sweden or Swedish language or culture or anything like that. But I had that strong sense that I had completed a homecoming for people who left at the end of the 19th century in the face of economic hardship and could never go back home again. That I had somehow, in my bones, picked up an ancestral mission. Makes no sense consciously, but I felt it very deeply within. It came to the ego as an other presence, as it were. And then in the context of speaking in Stockholm, Swedish people said to me, well, you look Swedish and you talk Swedish, although I was speaking English, of course. And no one ever said that in my life. And then as we traveled around the country, we had 10 days or so to travel, I had repeated experiences of deja vu. And yet I had never studied photographs of Sweden or anything whatsoever. It could have been Swaziland as far as I knew. But I had repeated senses of having been there before. Now, I think of myself as a rational person. And this beggars reason. I couldn't understand why, but I had a profound sense of ancestral connection there. I do not know what this means. If I did, it wouldn't be mystery. Or if I did understand it, it would not be mystery. All I can say is it was a felt, moving experience of another kind of energy at work that lay outside the sphere of ego consciousness and understanding. And when these things happen to us, the ego then, you see, is obliged to reframe its sense of reality. Jung wrote in a letter a very disturbing notion. He said once when someone asked him, how do you understand the word God? And he said, I call God that which flings itself violently across my path and alters my conscious intention for good or for ill. Now think about that. You'll never find that in a work of theology. But I think what Jung was saying there was whenever the ego is brought to encounter that which obliges a substantial reframing of understanding, reframing of relationship, one is in the presence of the mystery. And so I felt that throughout my experience in Sweden. Now, let me give you another example. These are very personal ones, but my point is quite simply, you have them too, if you pause to reflect upon them from time to time. Not make too much out of them, just pay attention. That's all we're talking about. The word therapy from the Greek therapoion means to listen or attend to. Psyche is soul, so psychotherapy is listening or attending to the expressions of the soul. Another experience is one that, despite my revulsion around the casinos and the corruption that they breed and the deception which they foster, my wife and I, one of my transcendent experiences was in a casino. And my wife and I were given tickets by someone who couldn't attend some sort of performance at a casino, so we went. And it turned out that the seats magically were in the front table and the front seats in the center of the stage. There were about 600, 700 people there. And it was a variety show with actors and singers and acrobats and comedians and so forth, and by and large pretty dreary. But halfway through, two acrobats from Mexico asked for a volunteer from the audience, and of course nobody would volunteer, so they went into the audience and dragged this poor guy up on the stage, and suddenly I realized it was me. And I remember thinking, my mother was right. I should never go to a place like this, you see. And so they asked me my name, and I told them. And then he said, well, where are you from? And time stopped. Now, one could say, well, you had stage fright. Well, I don't think so. It was surreal. And I think the surreality of it threw me into a state of disassociation. In other words, my ego was present, but it was also paying attention over here. We do that all the time. We call it daydreaming, for example. Or, heavens, how do you ever get to work when you're thinking about 1,400 things instead of the car in front of you, you know? But so the psyche can have differentiated levels of awareness in any given moment. And so he asked, where are you from? And it was like there was a teleprompter there, and all the places I've lived started rolling before me in a slow crawl. And I'm thinking about this. Now, this is in milliseconds, but enough of those becomes awkward in front of a live microphone. And he's thinking, you know, we had to pull up this dummy, you know. And he said, oh, I asked you too tough a question, huh? So, meanwhile, the teleprompter continues, and I'm literally looking at these names of places, and I started to say, Zurich. Then I thought, no, that's a metaphor. He's not going to understand metaphor. Metaphors don't go too well in casinos. I'm thinking all this. Again, milliseconds. And I started to say, Zurich. And then he says, don't you know? And then I said, oh, Linwood, New Jersey, which was 4 miles away. And then we went on in this act, and I nearly got killed in the act, physically. It was a very dangerous set of acts that I was the stooge in. And to this day, I'm astonished that they would even pull a stranger in like that because of the liability issues. I mean, I literally could have been hurt very seriously. And as we're walking out, people are sort of nudging me, saying, you're part of the act, aren't you? I mean, nobody could have been that dumb, you see. And I kept saying, no, we just came for the evening. It's last time, you know. And but on the way home, and then later, of course, I reflected, what was that all about? And I am convinced it was the surreality of the moment that threw me into the unconscious. And the question came up, what is home? Where is our home? There are places we live and carry out our lives, but is that our home? I began to realize that the reason that had come up from the deepest regions of the psyche was that it was a metaphor for the journey. I spent just 6 years of my life in Zurich, and what it embodied was a specific undertaking of a journey. And that the answer I was getting to that question from the deep regions of the psyche were that your home is your journey, not the place you live. Places matter because they may support or oppose the choices of your life, but the real home is the journey, and the journey is our home. And once we begin to realize that, then we realize we carry our home wherever we go. Our journey is implicit in everything we do. And that was a profound aperture, as I said, into the invisible world. I could give you other examples. I could give you 100 from patients that I've had through the years, and 100's a short list. But these things happen all the time. These are moments where you simply have to ask, what's going on here? What's that about? What does that mean to me? It might mean something else to someone else. Not to mention the rich dream work that we experience every night, averaging about 6 dreams per night, as sleep research tells us. Nature doesn't waste activity, so that endeavor is profoundly linked to the psychological and perhaps somatic development of the organism. But the whole point is, again, to recognize the aperture into the invisible world is what really gives us our vital link to the world. And sometimes we find it in relationship, and sometimes we find that in work, and sometimes we find it in these other moments that simply come to us. And then the last point is, if that is truly the case, if our home is our journey, then we could say perhaps, by extension, that our community is the community of exiles. And I mean that in the sense in which, if we are not served very well, again, by the images available to us from our culture, then we have been forced in some way to settle for the cultural surrogates, such as addictions, materialism, distraction, and so forth, or to undertake a private journey. And many times at a meeting like this, one realizes, well, there are other people that are strange and weird like me. There are other people who, whatever their investments in daily life, still find the need, appropriately so, for some sort of connection with that which brings an image, a picture, an idea, a challenge to their lives. So the community of exiles is very real, and it's very large, as a matter of fact. So our common task then is, in a sense, not only to live out our own specific individuation project, which has nothing to do whatsoever with the ego's aggrandizement. Quite the contrary, it's about the ego's submission to that which wishes to come into the world through us, and to also be faithful to the community of exiles that we are all part of. So each of us then is, in a sense, challenged to write our piece of the story. And what is your story, and who's writing it? That's going to be our subject tomorrow, is what is our story, and who or what is writing it. There's a deeply coursing consistency between the child that we were and the person that we are tonight. And if we forget this link to our own history, we have, in some sense, been dismembered, and we have to remember, reconnect, recognize with that original sense of selfhood that is there in infancy and early childhood. And so then this is the way I would summarize it for myself, and it may or may not speak to you. I would say from childhood on, though I would never have languaged it this way nor conceived it, from childhood on, it's been the search for the invisible, coursing beneath the surface of the visible world. That gave me the journey. Often frustrating, disappointing, wounding. It's also brought unmerited blessings by bringing greater acquaintances along the way, including dark divinities at times, all of them worthy of and demanding respect and remembrance. Because in the end, having an interesting life, in other words, to recognize in your own life the high drama that occurs every day. And I mean the next sentence literally, getting out of bed is an heroic act. There are 1,000 ways of not getting out of bed in the course of a day, including staying unconscious. Getting out of bed and dealing with the sea monsters of lethargy that would swallow us, or the dragons of fear that would eat us alive in the course of any given day. Those are tasks worthy of an Odysseus. And everyone's life is full of tragedy in the sense in which we become the agents of our own decline and defeat, and at the same time are the agencies of a heroic movement through those monsters into perhaps a larger life. A life that disturbs complacency. A life that pulls us out of the comfortable. A life that demands a larger engagement, a spiritual engagement than we had planned or feels comfortable is in the end what matters most to us. To have been here, to have shown up, to have wrestled with these questions, to live larger and larger questions. Rilke said once, our task is to continuously be defeated by ever larger things. Now, I think it's profoundly to a point here. The ego says, what's this defeat business? I didn't have that in mind. But what Rilke's suggesting is to be defeated by ever larger things means one is in a developmental agenda. One is taking on a larger journey. To have kept one's appointment with destiny. To have taken one's journey through this sometimes dark, sometimes bitter, sometimes luminous and wondrous universe. To have risked being who we really are is what matters most. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning tonight, I realize that the title and the attempt is pretentious. I don't mean it that way. What I do mean is that as I reflect on these matters, certain things come up for me as mattering, and my hope is that you would reflect too in the context of your life to ask what matters most to you. Now, I'm under instructions for us to take a break. We'll do so for 10 minutes, then we'll come back for your comments, questions, protests, and observations. Thank you. Here we are. This is your opportunity for thoughts, comments, protests. Remember, if we're not out of here on time, stragglers will be shot. Yeah.
You use the term dark divinities. I'm intrigued. Dark divinities.
Yes, now what's the question?
I'm intrigued. I've never heard that before.
I meant dark in both the senses that they are often take us to difficult and dark places, and also dark because mysterious. If they weren't, they wouldn't be mysteries. Again, when we think about the notion of mystery from a psychological standpoint, we have to resist falling into a theological formulation or a metaphysical formulation. And Jung repeatedly said, I'm an empiricist. He said, I'm trying to study how the psyche works, how it experiences. And it's not about making a statement about ultimate absolute reality. What it is a statement about how we experience our lives, how we experience this world. And that's why he had that formulation of whatever sort of radically reconfigures our sense of self and world is an engagement with mystery, which is to say on a daily basis we're swimming in it. It's not like it could happen out there somewhere. We're swimming in it. And the key is to reflect on it, because all of us, myself included, become creatures of habituation, creatures of reflexive responses. In fact, one of our most addictive patterns is habit. And it's understandable. It's not only how we bring order to chaos, it's one of the means by which we structure our lives. So when our habits are interrupted, even small things, the paper is not there in the morning where you expect it, or there's more traffic on the way to work, we get sort of out of joint, irritated, diseased. We'd have to say, why? In the great scheme of things, it's trivial and we won't even remember it tomorrow. And yet that dislocation is a psychological fact. It says something about habit, predictability, control, as being one of the means by which the ego makes its way in a mysterious world. Nothing wrong with that. It's just, again, a reminder of the provisional nature of our understanding of all things. So wherever we come to a point where our roadmap or our patterns don't fit the territory anymore, we're going to feel some anxiety, some distress. If you landed in a foreign airport, the first thing you would do would be look for signs in English. Understandably, because you're trying to bring to an utterly new experience what one has understood of the past. And if signs aren't there, then you'd start looking around for people who spoke English, perhaps. And then if you didn't find that, your distress level would rise further, and you'd look for international signs for customs or the bathrooms or whatever. And with each dislocation of the conventional signs that help us structure our lives, there would be a greater sense of disorientation and anxiety. And paradoxically, all of life is that way. Every moment is unique. And one of the good things about the human ego and about our psychic capacity is the ability to have constancy and to have consistency and to be able to bind our days together and to build on past experience so we don't have to learn elemental things over every day. The bad news, though, is as I was pointing out, so many of our core perceptions of self and world are based on infantile perceptions that were perhaps real for the child or misinterpretations, but were there initially. No matter how tall the skyscraper, we still have to go through the ground floors to get to the top, and they are the archaic modes of apprehension, the archaic perceptions of self and world, and the elemental strategies for management. And when they are autonomous and we don't know they're there, they have all the greater power of that of which I am unconscious as its greatest power in my life. And when they're not there, we feel distress. So again, the whole idea here is for the ego, by ego I mean our conscious sense of who we are at any given moment, to reflect on these matters and to say, what does this mean? Where does this come from? Where have I been here before? What's been activated here? What is this? What's the analogy? Because every moment is new, but we continuously try to understand it by way of the analogies to the old. And again, there's a productive dimension to that. It's how we build on experience. At the same time, that you can see there can be a replication, there could be a repetition. We can be bound to these archaic perceptions. So what I called the dark gods was simply a way of saying the mysteries are obscure. Heraclitus said once, the soul is a vast and distant country, so vast we will never be able to wholly approach it nor explore it. And that's what you carry within. So if I'm not being clear about this, that's deliberate. Okay. There was someone here. Yes, please.
If I were to live almost anywhere else in the world, my daily life would be much more at risk, personal physical risk than here in this country. And yet, it seems to me that we are an enormously fearful society. We're always personally, we have the vast military. All these nebulous forces outside are coming to get us, and so we project all this power out into the world. And I would like to try and understand why, personally or collectively, what mechanism drives that, and what does that mean to us? What is the meaning of that for us personally and culturally?
Could you just hold this a little closer to your mouth?
Oh,
and I think
yes, sorry.
And just repeat the last couple of sentences to frame the question.
I'm curious about the mechanism what does that mean personally and collectively to us? What is the mechanism of that fear that drives us in that direction?
I couldn't hear every part of your question, but the parts I heard, I think it has to do with sort of how we manage or fail to manage the anxieties of daily life, including international circumstances and so forth. Well, it's understandable because, after all, life is lethal. And as I mentioned, we're conscious of that. somewhere it gets home to us. And we begin to recognize that we are vulnerable and perishable, and we have a consciousness around that of some kind. Now, again, what you do about that makes an enormous amount of difference. And so there are certain ploys that the ego has, which I don't want to judge. I just want to say they have their pluses and their minuses. One of which is denial. I mean, our most primitive defense is denial. If I don't deal with it, I don't have to deal with it. Now, it may deal with me, but I don't have to deal with it. Repression. I push it under. And if it's repressed, I'm not having to deal with it. Suppression, where I push it under deliberately and consciously as a way of avoidance. Or I can project it onto someone else. I can take everything that's disreputable in here and repulsive in here and put it out there on you. And it's so much easier to despise you than to despise myself. Last time I was here, we were talking about the shadow. And I said that the shadow in its functional way would represent those aspects of ourselves that when brought into consciousness, we find contradictory to our ego ideal or asks something larger of us than feels comfortable. Should not be associated with evil per se, although evil can come from the shadow. It also could come from our best parts, our creativity, our spontaneity, our impulse to become in the world, which is fraught with all kinds of risks. And so we ally ourselves against that by repressing it or projecting it onto others. And collective projections, of course, produce bigotry and racism and xenophobia between nations. And, how many countries have marched off to war singing Gott mit uns? God is on our side. We're going to destroy the infidel. You see, now that's an arrogation of righteousness by the ego in service to its own insecurity. Has any army ever marched off to war saying, my metaphor is better than yours? Because to use that sentence would imply a consciousness that what I'm talking about here is a fiction. I don't mean fiction is untruth. I mean from the Latin verb to make. It's a construct. We get the word fabric and factory from that. So a fiction is my construct of reality. It's not reality, it's my construct. And my construct may serve me well or may betray me at critical points. But the human ego, again, tends to repress, to run away from, to split off, to project onto others, whatever challenges it and threatens it. That's why I found so compelling and so challenging Rilke's notion about the continuous defeat by ever larger things. That's contrary to the ego's normal agenda, which has the hope of sovereignty, domination, control, satiety, and peace. Nothing wrong with peace, but in a sense, it would be at the price of the necessary tension of opposites that goes on continuously in nature and within ourselves. So again, whatever my ego does that's contrary to my nature is going to produce a certain disassociation. And the old name for that was neurosis, meaning simply a split between our nature naturing and some other kind of received agenda. The more divergent the agenda, the deeper the split within. As Freud said so succinctly, the price of civilization is neurosis, meaning by that there is a progressive split between instinctual guidance and the claims of the social contract around you. And the social contract has a right to make claims on us. We have a right to expect each other to stop at stoplights. We ask you to overcome your haste and your narcissism to stop at a stoplight. And we're counting on each other to do that. So there's a legitimate trade-off there. Ultimately, our survival and well-being is served by that. But in many more abstract areas, such as Atlantic City and Las Vegas, and I mention that again, not non-judgmentally, but just descriptively. What is it that those migrations are about? It's unconscious spirituality. It's people who've lost mythic connection to the dark gods, to the earth, to each other. And so there is a kind of aggrieved search for those connections in the the palaces that are constructed to evoke projections. You think of their names: the Trump Castle, the Taj Mahal. I mean, the names themselves conjure up the illusion of romance and adventure and so forth, and quite deliberately so, by people whose children you're helping put through college, by giving them your money. Now again, what is it that's about? It's about whatever I cannot face in myself, whatever I cannot tolerate in myself, I will be looking for out there in the world. I've used the example in the past of a gentleman I saw many years ago who had grown up in a very difficult economic environment in the inner city of another part of the country, and for him, when he acquired money through selling his parents' ma and pa store, he would buy several automobiles a year, several. And his joke was, as soon as the windshield wiper fluid is empty, it's time to get a new car. And he knew that this was futile, but for the child, a new car driving down the street was an image of the numinous. The word numinous comes from a Latin verb that means to wink, to beckon, to nod, to solicit your attention. So whatever is denied in here will go out there and come shining back at me. And therefore, no wonder I wish to possess that. And if it is to be embodied in an automobile, then theoretically it would work. But even he would laugh at this kind of peculiar addiction. I know it's a piece of metal and rubber and glass that takes me from here to there and costs me money, but he said, I keep having to buy new ones. And we understand in the unmet needs of the child was this archaic fantasy embodied in the automobile that meant freedom, mobility, away from here, and the shiny distraction from the tawdry nature of his family's existence. That's powerful stuff. And unless in some way we can own that as our stuff, then it will forever have a hold on us outside of us. Now, this is not being moralistic. Don't want you to hear it that way. It's just being descriptive. Because the bottom line is pragmatism. How well does it work? How's it working for you? Does it work? Does it really achieve what it's supposed to achieve? And if not, then we need to look at that. Somewhere else there was a hand. Yeah.
I have one.
Where's the mic?
Yep.
Oh, right here.
Thanks, by the way, for all you've brought us tonight. This is a kind of a follow-up question, and it's I'm going to ask you to reflect more on your ideas about the dragons of fear and the relation of the internal to the external. A few years before 9/11, a Marxist scholar wrote that the contemporary state governs through an administration of fear. Now, if that was true of the United States and other governments before 9/11, it was true on steroids during the Bush administration. And my question is, how did this coordinated Bush administration orchestration of fear interact with those of us in midlife between 9/11 and now who've been trying to overcome our personal histories of being governed by fear? Again, the relationship between the external and the internal.
Well, I don't think that's a question. I think that's a statement. Because there's obviously a connection. And organizations have often utilized psychopathology and activated in deliberate ways to produce certain kinds of responses. What do you think marketing is? Marketing does the same thing. Why should you be buying product X as opposed to product Y? Well, it's an evocation of a kind of a complex or of a psychic association that will lead you perhaps even to override your own legitimate self-interest. So there's always a pool of fear floating around. I hate to sound reductionistic, but as I said, the first chapter in this book was, you better recognize it because that's what's running our lives most of the time. If you track it long enough, you'll come back to those places. Even the most rationalized behaviors often are in defense of that. And I'm not judging that. I'm just saying descriptively, that's because, again, we're finite and mortal and conscious of it. And there are certainly people, elements, institutions who will make great use of that and mobilize that. There was an exchange in a play by Bertolt Brecht once to one character asked sort of, how did it happen, referring to Germany? And one character responds, well, you organize all the madmen. And then another person responds, no, you organize the people. And you can organize the people with appeals to fear, appeals to collectivity, appeals to self-interest, and appeals to sacrifice. All of these are aspects of our psychological reality, and whether they play out in a positive or a negative way, sort of begs the question, who's doing it in service to what? I mean, that's again a very pragmatic question. When we do something, it's like, why are we really doing it and in service to what? Because even a good behavior could be in service to an old archaic defense against fear. Or could be a rationalization or flight from looking at that. So I think you know the answer in your statement, that there is a motive for anyone who has a point of view to psychologically seek to affect the other, to bring about a compliance with that point of view. That's as old as human nature. You find it everywhere. And what that says then is, wheresoever I am ignorant of what's going on inside of me, or not looking at my own issues or shadow, I'm going to be all the more at the mercy of these external manipulations of political, religious, commercial value. Obviously, I won't belabor the point, you all know this, the health of a democracy depends on the sober reflection of individuals who search out their own conscience. And when that happens, something wonderful occurs, self-governance. And when it's subverted, something awful happens. Another thought or question? Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak to what happens on the other side of realizing that you've become your own biggest obstacle.
Yes. If I come on the what, please?
What happens on the other side of the realization that you've become your own biggest obstacle?
Oh, good question. Remember I said that the most important thing I learned in 6 years in Zurich was that what we've become is our chief obstacle. It then has to do with the acknowledgement, without judgment, without criticism, without shame, of saying, I have become an assemblage of behaviors, attitudes towards self and others, and reflexive responses. Emphasis upon the reflexive character, meaning it's not even conscious, it's stimulus response, that helped me get this far, managed my life, helped the little toddler move in and out of the big people, and has managed to survive to this point. And to say, as necessary as they were, they also are based on a disempowered past. They are understandably and necessarily adaptive rather than generative. They are our response, because one of the messages we all got is that the world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. Now, just adapt yourself to that fact to function for the next few decades. And then you realize, well, as necessary as that was, then how has that pushed me into this corner or that corner? How has it made this choice obligatory and kept me from making that choice? Now, once in a while, one can go back and redo the choice. Many times one can't because they're tied to a certain time or place or situation. All one can do is to say, I can never underestimate the power of those reflexive responses that show up at the key junctures of my life or show up in daily life. Never underestimate their power to simply repeat the same old, same old. And underneath this, of course, is the human psyche that has its own agenda. And we won't pay attention to that until it hurts enough. In other words, why would the ego ever question its adaptive strategies unless it had fallen into a substantial depression or it experienced the breakup of a marriage or suffered something that happened that causes a person to say, what's going on here? One has to feel some sense of disorientation or suffering sufficient to really get the ego's attention to say, all right, now I have to pay attention to this in a different way. Now, in 1885, Tolstoy wrote a novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which would translate loosely as John Johnson. It's meant to be the story of an ordinary person who gets all the clues from his culture, adapts to all of them, and sort of functions as a perfectly ordinary individual. And he tries to move into the right neighborhood, marry the right person, achieve a career advance, and so forth. And then in his prime is stricken with an illness. And he says, what's this? This doesn't fit into the plan. And for the first time in his life, he begins to question the conduct of his life. And it's a private questioning because nobody else wants to buy into it. And Tolstoy shows that it's in the last 3 days of his life, he has his first genuine human conversation with the peasant servant who's attending him while everybody else is distracted. And after he dies, his wife wants to find out about the insurance. His colleagues want to know who moves into his position in the company. And everybody wants to get the funeral over so they can get to their card game that night. In other words, it's someone else's story. It's not mine. It has no bearing on me. Now, Tolstoy wrote that in 1885. Why? He must have thought about this and realized that in this person's life, it took a terminal illness to cause him to reframe his relationship to his own life. So you'd have to say, well, what does it take for that to happen? And many of us have had appointments with our own lives and haven't shown up for the appointment. And I can assure you the psyche will provide other appointments. And on each of those occasions, one would have to say, you know, maybe my old map helps me here, works for this. Maybe it doesn't. Periodically, we just outgrow the old map. That's the good news. That's called growth. Or we just move into a different stage of the journey. You know, as our body keeps changing and our emotional life changes and our social roles change, there's a natural evolutionary process. And as Jung has said in his essay on the 2 stages of life, whoever, you know, clings to the law of the first half of life will find it tyrannous in the second half of life. You know, will be bound by it, constricted by it. And so, as Adolf Guggenbiel Craig wrote in an essay on old age, he has a fine, it's called Old Age and Fools. And he wants to dismiss any romantic fantasy about old age. He said, your body hurts, you have no energy, you're depressed, you lose your friends, or they've lost you. There's only one virtue. He says, you can act like a damn fool and get away with it. Because nobody pays any attention to you. And they can just write you off as an old fool. And he said that could be the best time of your life. Because you don't have to be normal or consistent or predictable. Now, there's a little more to his argument than that, but that's the core of it. Because the divine fool is an archetype that has to do with accessing the wisdom of nature that may be quite contrary to the wisdom of the culture. And when that is served, it means one is oriented in a quite different way, to a quite different center of gravity. Maybe one more question, and then we can depart for the evening before we're shot. Yes, way back there.
Yes, sir. How would you direct a client with, I guess, moral ambiguity to embrace their shadow? I mean, how do you navigate those dangers of possibly, like you said even before, going to the darker, I hate to use the word, the moral code, or the more evil aspects of the shadow? How do you direct a client to navigate those dangers?
Well, did you hear the question? How does one in a therapeutic setting sort of navigate the encounters with the shadow? It's not that I would have a plan for that person. Usually it's because the shadow has broken through into their life in a way that it becomes a necessary subject of reflection. People who haven't reflected don't come to therapy. People who've experienced it in some way that was troubling to them are more likely to ask questions about that. So I would say it depends on the form in which it occurs and how it's experienced by that person. And when we think, remember, when we think of the shadow, we have to think about those parts of our life, our values, our institutions, that are contradictions to what we wish or intend for ourselves or our lives, and are maybe contradictory to our values. Just yesterday, I was talking with a person who's had a chronic depression, and he has prided himself on a certain theology. And as part of his family history, it goes back a long, long way. And I said, well, in fact, though, your theology is this, but your psychology is Calvinist. In other words, you seem predestined to be depressed. And you seem burdened with the weight of a history that is not addressable. Now, there's a paradox here. Is that there, and I say this again without any judgment, there is a certain comfort in being depressed. It means I don't have to show up. And that's what this person's life is about. And my message to him is that he has to show up. And yeah, he's had a depression. He has a depression. And probably will continue to have one. Whether there's a biological basis to it or not, he refuses to address. He wouldn't consider medication, and that may or may not be a good decision. But the key, the real shadow here is not the depression. It's that he has decided to become its victim. Where's the shadow, you would say? The shadow is in not showing up. The shadow is in being passive in the face of suffering. And there was a word for that, and it was pathos. We get the word pathetic from that. Tragedy came from, among other things, the notion of active suffering, that one is in the amor fati, the active struggle with the fate that has come to us. And so the shadow there is in a certain way the easy acquiescence to being a victim, to being passive, to not struggling. Now, one wouldn't think of that as shadow normally. And yet one would have to say, and Jung addressed this question very specifically, in every therapy, he said one should ask the question, what task is this person's neurosis helping him or her avoid? And one task we all avoid is growing up. By which I mean, quite simply, understanding this is our life, we're accountable for it, we have to make the decisions, nobody else. That sounds so simple, and I think it's so difficult. Growing up is a very difficult thing to do. It means being accountable. And there are times that our choices lead to evil. And even the good carried too far can lead to the evil. And as Jung said once, sometimes the good is the enemy of the better. And Kierkegaard wrestles with this in his book on Fear and Trembling. And he chooses what he calls the scandal of Abraham and Isaac. and said, how could one ever countenance the idea of slaying one's child? And yet here's a patriarch of the faith who is in that relationship. And he talks about how there is the narcissistic mode of being in the world, of self-interest, and then there's the moral stage where one obeys the social code. And he said then sometimes there's the religious summons, which he said leads to the teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning by that something higher than the good. And knowing what a slippery slope that is on. If you saw your neighbor about to slit the throat of his child, you would rightly intervene or call the authorities. And here's the patriarch of the faith, prepared, reportedly, to do that. And so one would have to say that part of the paradox of the shadow is that sometimes we are called to that which is higher than the moral in service to the soul. But that one has to do that, as Kierkegaard said, in fear and trembling, rather than simply as a kind of narcissistic inflation. Well, the whole point of this evening, as I said, and the point of the book, is to ask you to reflect on what matters. All of us would come up with a different list. Some of our lists would agree, and some of them would be quite idiosyncratic, and rightly so. And I thank you for coming and invite you to come tomorrow, and we'll have more confusion.